Every government claims to serve the people. Every politician promises stability, prosperity, and growth. But behind the speeches, behind the campaigns, there is another force, quieter, more technical, but far more powerful. That force is the central bank. Central banks don't march in parades. They don't run for office. Most people can't even name the people in charge, yet these institutions decide how much money exists, who gets bailed out, which banks live and which banks die. They can make your mortgage cheaper, your savings worthless, or your retirement fund collapse, and they can do it all without a single vote from you. This is the secret history of central banks, how a handful of institutions became the real power brokers of the modern world. To understand their rise, we need to go back to the 17th century. Europe was in turmoil. Wars drained treasuries, kings spent lavishly, and governments were constantly short on hard money. In England, King William III needed cash to fund war against France, but lenders were wary. The crown had a reputation for defaulting. This new institution had a special privilege. It could issue notes, paper promises backed by the government's debt. For the first time, money in circulation was not just metal coins, but paper backed by the credit of the state. The Bank of England became both the king's creditor and the nation's banker. The lesson was clear. Control the flow of credit, and you control the state itself. Other nations copied the model. Sweden had founded the Riksbank earlier in 1668, but it was the Bank of England that became the prototype. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, central banks spread across Europe, always tied to governments that needed reliable credit for wars, empires, and industrial expansion. By the Napoleonic era, the link between war and finance was unmistakable. Napoleon's armies marched on credit as much as gunpowder. Britain's ability to borrow through its central bank gave it the financial muscle to outlast France. The pound sterling, backed by the Bank of England, became the anchor of the global financial system. Wars were not just won on battlefields, they were won in the balance sheets of central banks. But the real transformation came in the 20th century. In the United States, the financial system had long been fragmented and chaotic. Banks issued their own notes. Panics erupted when confidence failed. The most famous came in 1907, when a collapse on Wall Street spread across the country. Banks failed, depositors panicked, and the entire system teetered on the edge. It wasn't the government that saved the day. It was a private banker, J.P. Morgan. From his mansion, Morgan summoned other financiers, locked the doors, and forced them to provide liquidity to stop the panic. One man had stabilized the American financial system more effectively than Congress. For the political class, this was both humiliating and terrifying. America needed an institution that could act like Morgan, but on behalf of the nation. In 1913, after years of debate and secret meetings on Jekyll Island, a private retreat where bankers and politicians drafted the plan in secrecy, Congress created the Federal Reserve System. The Fed was designed to be independent from day-to-day politics, but deeply connected to Wall Street. It could issue currency, set interest rates, and act as a lender of last resort. In effect, it was America's new financial engine, privately influenced, publicly sanctioned. Few people realized how much power had just been created. World War I was the first great test. The costs of industrial warfare were staggering, and no nation could pay for it with taxes alone. Central banks stepped in. They printed money, issued bonds, and kept governments solvent. The gold standard, the old anchor of money, was abandoned as nations suspended convertibility. The lesson was brutal. When governments face existential crisis, central banks will always finance them. The printing press was no longer a last resort, it was policy. By the end of the war, inflation had ripped through Europe. The German Reichsbank, under political pressure, printed marks until they became worthless. Weimar's hyperinflation remains the most infamous example of a central bank destroying an economy. But even that disaster didn't end the experiment. It only confirmed how central banks were now indispensable, whether for stability or collapse. The Great Depression showed their darker side. In the late 1920s, speculation drove markets higher and higher. When the bubble burst in 1929, the Federal Reserve failed to act aggressively. Banks collapsed, credit froze, millions lost jobs. Economists still debate whether the Fed's tight policies deepened the depression. But one thing became clear. A central bank's choices can decide the fate of millions. Governments took note. After World War II, they sought to coordinate central banking on a global scale. In 1944, as the war raged, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The plan was ambitious, to build a new international financial system. The US dollar, backed by gold, would sit at the center. Other currencies would peg to the dollar, and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank would provide global stability. But behind it all was a simple fact. The US Federal Reserve and the US Treasury now sat at the heart of the world economy. Money itself had become geopolitics. The illusion shattered in 1971. Mounting debts from the Vietnam War and domestic spending pressured America's gold reserves. Foreign nations began demanding gold for their dollars. President Richard Nixon faced a choice: let the gold drain away or break the system. He chose the latter. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. The anchor of the Bretton Woods system was gone. From that moment, the world lived under pure fiat money, currencies backed only by government decree, managed by central banks. The age of restraint was over. Central banks now had unlimited flexibility. They could create money at will. And they have. Consider the crises of the last half-century. In the 1980s, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20% to crush inflation. The result was a brutal recession, but also the restoration of trust in the dollar. The Fed had shown it could wield its power like a hammer, reshaping the economy with a single policy. In 2008, when the global financial system imploded, central banks responded with unprecedented force. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, all created trillions of dollars, euros, and yen to bail out banks and prop up markets.
Ow.
They called it quantitative easing. For Wall Street, it was salvation. For ordinary savers, it was theft. Low interest rates and rising asset prices enriched the few while punishing the many. In 2020, during the pandemic, the process went into overdrive. Central banks printed on a scale once unimaginable. Stimulus checks, bailouts, corporate rescues, all funded by money conjured at a keystroke. The balance sheets of major central banks exploded to levels no one thought possible. The justification was always the same: stability. The cost was inflation, asset bubbles, and the quiet realization that money is now whatever central bankers say it is. This is the hidden truth. Central banks are not neutral referees. They are power brokers. They decide who suffers recessions and who gets rescued. They decide which institutions survive a crisis and which collapse. They can inflate away debts or trigger deflationary pain. Their decisions reach deeper into your life than any election, and yet they operate behind a curtain of complexity. Interest rates, liquidity facilities, bond purchases, the jargon disguises the reality. These institutions create money and allocate credit on a scale no private actor could dream of. Every time central banks intervene, they expand their role. Every time they print to save markets, they make the system more dependent on their rescue. Every bailout, every liquidity injection, increases the expectation that next time will be the same. The result is a global economy addicted to central bank support, and the contradictions are mounting. Governments run record deficits, assuming their central banks will keep interest rates low. Banks take reckless risks, knowing central banks will step in. Investors chase bubbles, confident the Fed put will protect them. But history teaches us that illusions always crack. The Bank of England's credibility was shaken in the 18th century. The Reichsbank collapsed into hyperinflation. The Bretton Woods system fell apart in 1971. Every financial architecture, no matter how powerful, eventually hits a breaking point. So what does this mean for you? It means recognizing that central banks, not politicians, are the real managers of money. When they choose to inflate your wages by less, when they choose to tighten, your mortgage doubles. When they rescue markets, asset owners win and savers lose. It means understanding that the world runs on trust, and trust is fragile. If people lose faith in the dollar, in the euro, in the yen, central banks cannot print credibility. It means remembering that resilience lies not in promises from bankers, but in assets they cannot create at will. Gold, land, skills, productive businesses. These have survived every collapse of monetary trust. The secret history of central banks is not really a secret at all. It is written in every crisis, every bailout, every inflationary spiral. These institutions were born to serve governments. They grew by financing wars. They expanded by stabilizing crises. And today they sit at the heart of a financial empire that spans the globe. They are not elected. They're not accountable in the way parliaments or presidents are. Yet their decisions shape your life more than almost any law. This is the paradox of modern finance. The people we never vote for control the money we cannot live without. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The answers aren't hidden in the future, they're written in the past.